We started laying the groundwork a little bit in Module 1 for the topics that we're going to discuss here, but security is a really big aspect of how you're going to handle your 365 or your Dynamics 365 implementations. If you have a poorly designed security structure, that's not only going to cause problems from maybe having the wrong people have access to information, but it also could really put the information in the wrong hands, which could have some very serious consequences as you're moving forward. So we talked a little bit about in the previous module this whole concept of business units and using business units as your structure for your organization. In this module, what I want to do is I want to expand on that a little bit more, and I want to start talking about the remaining items that are involved in a 365 application security. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the security model and what is the intent of the security model inside Dynamics 365. So not only how does it work to control access to data, but also how it controls access to just what people can see inside the application. Do they have access to get to sales or service and whatnot as you're moving forward? We're also going to look at how we work with security roles and how to create security roles and how the different concepts of access levels and privileges work to control what people have access to. And then we're also going to expand kind of on the users and the team stuff that we talked about in the last module and really look at how they work with security roles and how the combination of having somebody be an individual user and a member of a team and then having that associated with a security role truly can give you a lot of different options around who can do what inside the application. As we talked about on the previous slide, the purpose of the security model is to do more than just provide record access. It's also really going to define what specific actions that a user can take on a specific record based upon who they are. So it controls access. So it looks at who you are, and it also looks at who owns that record. So it says, okay, this record is owned by Derek, and you're Derek, you should have access to it. Or this record is owned by Derek, but you're not Derek, should you have access to it? So it really looks at who you are and determines based upon who you are and other factors whether or not you should be able to physically go into that record. The other thing that it does is it controls access to specific UI elements inside the application. So for example, you can do what are called role-based forms where it can look at what specific security role is associated with your account and now determine what version of a form for an account you should be able to see. Or dashboards. Maybe you should only have certain dashboards available to you if you're a salesperson, and if you're a service person that has a service security role associated with it, now you should have these different dashboards. So it really looks at who you are and determines whether or not you can actually perform specific functionalities or what items should be presented to you. The other thing that it does is it controls access to specific features. So for example, you might be a company that puts their account representatives on like a probationary period for 6 months and says, okay, for the first 6 months that you're with us, we're going to give you very limited capabilities to actually do anything with the data. For example, I'm not going to let you export the information to Excel, because if I do that, maybe you could now leave and go be with our competitor or something like that. So the other thing that's nice with these security roles is I can control what users can do. Do they have access to use the mobile application? Can they print this information? So I can look at specific features of the application and limit what they can do from within there. And then the other thing that's nice with the entire kind of concept of the security model is it really does simplify what users are going to see from within the application. Because if I don't have access to contacts or I don't have access to cases inside the application, I'm just not even going to see them. So from a navigational standpoint, it also tailors what people are being presented with on the screen. And if you don't have the ability to work with that specific option, or you don't have privileges to work with that specific option, it just doesn't render. So it makes it much easier for people to only focus on the subset of information and the context in which they are working in order to see exactly what they need to work with. So as we talked about, a security role is the baseline functionality for who has access to do what inside the application. So it looks at who you are as a user or a member of a team that you belong to, and then it defines what you can do. So what it does is it actually associates permissions, and those permissions are actually defined by using what are called privileges and access levels. Now we're going to talk about both privileges and access levels here just in a little bit, but the privilege at its basic scenario says, As a user, you have the ability to delete accounts. An access level says to what degree can you perform that functionality. So I can delete accounts, but can I only delete accounts that I own, or can I delete accounts that are owned by other people? And so these are where you now really start to delve into what people can do. Now, every user, as we've kind of talked about moving forward, has to have at least one security role associated with them. Without a security role, they can't access the application, even though they already belong to a business unit. Now, you can do a couple of different situations when you start assigning security, assigning users to security roles. You can just associate the user with a security role. You can actually go in and create new security roles and then assign them to those security roles. There's different options for working with users and security roles, and we'll talk more about what those different options are as we move through and start working with it. Out of the box, there's several security roles that are already a part of the system from a Dynamics 365 standpoint. And these are some of your more common roles. So these are going to be things like sales manager, salesperson, marketing professional, all of these different roles, that you might normally see. Now you have the ability, if you want to kind of use those to get you up and running as quickly as possible. Or you can actually go in and kind of rename those and modify the specific privileges and access levels in each one of those to fit your organizational needs. So you have a lot of tailoring options available. You can use the ones that are there, you can modify the ones that are there, or you could just create a whole bunch of new ones based upon whatever your specific needs are, and then define the security structure from there when you're going through. The only one that you really don't have the capabilities to mess with a whole lot is the system administrator role. The system administrator role by default will give anybody who has that role pretty much complete access to do anything within the application. Now obviously you're not going to give every single user the system admin role, but you do have to have at least one person who has the system admin role. If you try to remove that one person, the system will not let you do that. So everybody has to have at least one security role, and the system will have at least one person who will be assigned the system administrator role, and that role does not have any modification capabilities. Now, as far as working with the roles, and we'll show you this, you're really just going to go into that settings and security roles, and then start modifying those to fit your specific needs. So let's look at these security roles a little bit. So I'm going to go into settings, and I went into security, and now I went into security roles. And so these are those out-of-the-box security roles that we talked about that you'll see. And then depending upon, if you use some of the preferred solutions that are out there, additional security roles might get added to the system. But these are typically the out-of-the-box security roles that you would see in kind of a standard CRM implement or a Dynamics 365 implementation. Let's just open up, for example, the salesperson security role. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. We'll maximize this. So it tells me what role it is, and it tells me what business unit it belongs to, and we'll talk a little bit more about roles and business units here in just a little bit. And then across the top, you're going to see different tabs, and these tabs are going to represent different types of records inside the organization. So obviously, like your core records are going to be things that aren't necessarily module specific. These are going to be things like your accounts and your contacts and your opportunities. These are going to be more of your entity-based permissions. And so these are one of the first things that you'll see is there's this concept of entity permissions, which allow you to control privileges and access levels at an entity level. And as I go across, I can see from a marketing perspective, I have, campaign, marketing list, then I get into orders, invoices. These are more of broken out by module. These aren't necessarily going to change. These are all built-in functionality around the application. The privileges and the actual depth to which people can do stuff, that can be modified, but what's actually presented in this screen, that's not necessarily modifiable from an application standpoint. Now, the other thing that you'll see if I scroll down here is I get into things called like miscellaneous privileges or task-based privileges. Most of these entity-based privileges allow me to really go down to a very depth or a very detailed situation where this person can create a record, delete a record, or update a record, and I can define 5 or 6 different levels in regards to how I want them to be able to work with that. Down here on these miscellaneous, these are basically just yes or no functionality. Can they print? Can they export to Excel? Can they work with Outlook? What are some of their different options around being able to access these options? So you'll see some of these privacy related options, which are basically called task task-based privileges, which are truly just kind of yes or no functionality. So each tab will have entity level permissions and then kind of task-based privileges, which will be kind of your yes or no based upon what that functionality is. The only other option that you're going to see in here is this custom entities option. As you start adding custom entities to the application, so if you've gone into the customization course and you've learned how to add entities and fields, as you've started adding custom entities, they will show up in here. And remember that by default, when a new custom entity is added, nobody other than people who have the system administrator security role associated with them will actually have access. So you do need to come in after the fact for every security role and grant access to the different privileges and access levels, which we will talk a little bit about and show you a little bit about here in just a couple of seconds. So in the previous example, we saw, the concept of security roles, and we saw the different little circles that you can click on to determine who should have access to what. Let's now dive into that in a little bit more detail and explain what those circles kind of mean. So there's a couple of different elements at play here. There's a concept of what are called privileges, and then there's a concept of what are called access levels. Think of privileges as really the most basic unit of security inside the application itself. So they define what I can do for each entity on the system. So for example, can I create a contact? Can I go in and can I look at accounts inside the system? Do I have the capabilities to delete cases? That's what we're talking about from a privilege perspective, is at an entity level, what can I do with that particular entity? Can I update? Can I delete? What are my different options? So you have to start with looking at the privileges first. Now let's dive into these privileges a little bit and let's look at this from kind of a security role standpoint. So if you see here, I have my account entity. So my account entity really has 8 different privileges that are associated with it. Can I create an account record in the system? Can I see it? Can I edit it or write to it? Can I delete it? Then I've got append to, which we'll talk about here in a couple seconds. Can I assign an account to another user? And then can I share an account? So these are your basic privileges. Now you'll notice that some of these entities don't necessarily have all of the privileges available to them. Some have, some have less. It just kind of depends. What typically kind of defines that is the ownership of the entity. So is this a user-owned entity versus an organization-owned entity? If it's a user-owned organization entity, you typically will have a few more privileges associated with it as opposed to just some of the out-of-the-box functionality or owner-based functionality. So these are kind of your baseline options that you would see from a privilege perspective. Now let's delve into these in just a little bit more detail and talk about what some of the different options are. So we talked about create. That one makes a lot of sense. Can I create a record for that particular entity? So can I create a new account? Read, can I see it in the information? Write, can I edit? So can I edit accounts within the application? Delete allows me to delete a record. Let's talk about append and append to. So append basically means, can I attach this entity to other records? So for example, you're going to have this concept where you're going to have an account record inside Dynamics 365. That account might have multiple contacts that you want to associate with it. In order to be able to associate contacts with an account, you have to have append privileges on the contact entity. So if I don't have append privileges on the contact entity, I can't associate contacts with other records. So I can't attach a contact to an opportunity or to an account or to an order. So I have to have that in order to attach that entity to other records. Append to privileges basically means, can I attach other records to this entity? So if you think about it in that contact and account example, in order for me to be able to associate a contact with an account, I have to have append to privileges on the account record, which means that I can go ahead and I can actually attach records to the account. But then I also have to have append privileges on the contact record, which says, okay, now I can associate or I can attach contacts to other records. That combination of those two items is what's going to allow me to attach contacts specifically to the account record in the application. And that's one area that sometimes, gives people a little bit of confusion, is the append and the append to, which one is which. And so let me show you that here in just kind of another slide. So this is your kind of append versus append append to. So if you look kind of down on the bottom, this is controlling what you would see kind of in the related areas of the record itself. So if I have append, like I said, that indicates that items can be attached to other records, so I can associate activities to other CRM records. Append to, like I said, indicates whether or not another record can be attached to it, so an account can have cases, contacts, opportunities, and what you're seeing in the application is a combination of both. So for example, I have append privileges on the account, or if I do not have append privileges on the account entity, I really don't have the ability to attach anything to it. I can't add activities, I can't add social profiles, I can't add anything to it. If I have append privileges to the account record, but I do not have append privileges on the documents, then I can attach stuff to the account, so I can see, Office 365 groups, activities, social profiles, but I can't see documents because I don't have the abilities to associate documents with any other records. So if I have append to privileges on the account entity, and I have append privileges on the documents entity, now you can see that I can now add documents to the account record. So it's a combination of both of those. And that's where you really need to look at what your underlying needs are, and then kind of define what you want to do moving forward. So as we mentioned, access levels work in conjunction with privileges. So we just talked about, privileges. Can I create a record? Can I update a record? Can I delete a record? Access levels define to what depth or what degree I can perform that privilege for a specific record. So for example, I can create or I can delete accounts. Can I delete accounts only that I own, or can I delete accounts that are owned by other people inside the organization? And if so, to what degree can I do that? So what happens with access levels is they're a combination of a couple of different situations. They look at who you are and what the record ownership is, and they also look at the business unit to which you belong to as a user. And those two factors will now control to what degree you can actually perform that privilege inside the application. And so if you looked back at kind of those security access levels, you saw that there was different circles with different kind of green circles, yellow circles, half circles. Those all constitute a different access level. And we'll show you that here when we get into the application. But let's first just look at access levels at a specific detailed level. So the first option that you can see is these are your different access levels. You can see that you have none, you have user, business unit, parent, and then organizational business unit. So each one of these represent to what degree you can perform a specific access or a specific action inside the application. So it's a combination of who you are, who owns the record, and what you want to do. So let's first look at this from a none perspective. So none is pretty straightforward. If I don't have the ability to do anything for that particular privilege, so for example, I have none set to delete accounts, I can't delete an account in the system, regardless of who owns that account. And that's actually a pretty common customization or a pretty common security measure is people will maybe force people to deactivate records instead of deleting them, and then they'll use some of the bulk delete functionality to go in and control who, when they're going to actually get deleted. The next one that you have is user. So what user does is it says you can do this particular privilege for any record that is owned by you or a team that you are a member of or is shared with you or a team that you are a member of. So for example, if I have edit rights on opportunities at a user level, that means that I can only edit opportunities that I own or are owned by a team that I'm a member of, or have been shared with me or a team that I'm a member of. Any other opportunity in the system, if somebody else owns it, I can't touch it. Then you get into business unit. So now business unit says basically you have all of the same access levels from a user access standpoint, but it also allows you to work with records that are owned or shared with users in your same business unit. So if I have read rights on opportunities at a business unit level, I basically can go in and see any opportunities that are owned by me, a team that I'm a member of, or anybody who is in the same business unit as me or has been shared with the same business unit, records that are in the same business unit. So if we're in the same business unit, I have access to those records. If they're in the support business unit, I don't have access to those particular records. Parent-child gives you business unit access plus the ability to work with records that are owned or shared with users in any subordinate business unit to your business unit. So if I'm in the sales business unit and I have parent-child, I would now have the ability to see all accounts in the system that are owned by me, anybody in the projects business unit, support business unit, or sales business unit. I can't see marketing or service because they're not a subordinate business unit to my perspective. So the more you give them, the more access options that I have. And then finally, we have organization. From an organization standpoint, now if I have organization access, it doesn't matter what business unit that belongs to. So if I have read access on accounts, I can see every account in the system if it's assigned at an organization level with no access based upon who they are. So you really need to look at this inside your implementation and determine what specific option is going to be best for you based upon what it is you're trying to accomplish. So we're back in the application on the salesperson security role. So we've talked about privileges and access levels. Let's kind of look at those in action now. So you can see down here on the bottom where I have this key, this is my different access levels assigned for that option. So for example, for a create, let's actually do delete on the account entity. Right now it's set to user access, which means that I can delete any accounts that are owned by me in the system. If I don't want anybody to be able to delete accounts, I can basically go ahead and just kind of click on these individual circles until it gets to the permission level that I want them to be able to have. So in this point, okay, I can not delete any accounts in any situation. From a share and assign standpoint, I want to only be able to share records if I own them or assign records if I own them. From a read perspective, I should be able to see all accounts in the system. From an edit perspective, I want to only be able to see accounts in the system if they are owned by somebody in the same business unit as myself or myself. And then append to, I'll set it organization, and append, I'll set it organization. So this is where you now would have to come in for each option and kind of define what specific permissions you want them to have. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of different circles that you can click on in order to facilitate that. There are some shortcuts in the system to make that a little bit easier. One of the options I can do is I can kind of click on account, and as I click on account, it'll kind of adjust the circles, and then as they get to the same level, as I click on it again, it kind of adjusts them all simultaneously. And as they all get to the same point, eventually I get to the point where I can just adjust them all individually. This is kind of a nice option if you're just trying to universally set permissions for a specific entity. You can kind of set them to however you want and then kind of work with information from there. So this is kind of a neat way that you can kind of facilitate that, relatively easily. You can also do it at a privilege level. Like I can go into a privilege level and I could do the same thing, and then as I click on those individual circles, it'll just kind of adjust. Now you'll notice that some of these, only have a couple of different options. That is directly related to some of the ownership options, but it at least gives you the ability to move through those. And then finally, if you go over into like the individual permissions, these are the same thing. I can either just kind of set these to yes or no and then work from there. But you have to do kind of a combination of each one of those options to determine which one you want to work best when you're moving forward. One of the questions you kind of have to ask yourself when you're working with these security roles is, how do you want to edit and create them? As you saw when we were kind of doing the last demo, there's a lot of little circles there. So sometimes people run into a situation where, okay, how am I going to create this security role? I can create a new security role from scratch. So for example, I could click on new, and let's just call this Derek's role. Now, when I do that, if I click on core records, I can see that every single option in here is set to none. So this would be one of those situations where now you would have to really kind of come in and set up this different security structure based upon how you want it to work. Now I'm going to show you a few different, examples of why you might do this here in just a little bit. But as you can see, there would be a lot of clicking that would have to be done to kind of facilitate how I want this process to work. So this is, this is an option, but as you can see, there would be a lot of setup on this depending upon how detailed you wanted to get with each individual permission. One of the other options that you have when it comes to creating security roles, and I will just kind of leave this one here for just a second, would be to take an existing security role, and there is, and actually one of the options that you would have on that security role is to go to Actions and choose Copy Role. And what happens when you go into Actions and Copy Role is it is actually going to create a copy of that salesperson security role. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call this, new salesperson. Now, when I do that, it opens up the role, creates the role, but it basically just makes a copy of the existing salesperson security role. So all the permissions have now been defined. So now all I would have to do is make the modifications in here that would make this particular situation unique. And we mentioned kind of at the top of the lesson, that might be from a new person standpoint, not letting them export information or go mobile. So then I could go into business management, and maybe in here, I'm not going to let them go offline. I'm not going to let them print, use the app, use mobile, export, mail merge, basically any of this stuff I'm not going to necessarily let them have access to. So now I could just adjust this slightly. I still have the same type of situation. I just don't necessarily have to worry about recreating everything from scratch. So there's a lot of different options. Now the other option would basically be you could just rename any existing security role and then adjust the permissions accordingly. So depending upon what your specific needs are inside your organization, there's a lot of different options for how you want to adjust the security. So the other consideration to kind of keep in mind is this concept of security role in business units. Because as you remember, when we were talking about access levels, one of the biggest things we talked about was, you can set access levels at a business unit level and say, okay, you only have access to do this particular item on records that you own or are owned by users in the same business unit. So security roles work in much the same situation. Security roles are actually created at a business unit level. And so when you create a security role, that security role actually has a business unit that is associated with it. And when you assign users security roles, those users must be assigned security roles that represent the business unit that they belong to. So what's kind of neat about that is when I create a security role, all of the different subsequent business units will inherit that same security role. So for example, if I were to go ahead and create at the root business unit level a social manager role, when I create that social manager role at the root business unit, the system says, okay, well, since sales, support, and projects are all a part of that same business unit or that same business unit structure, I am going to create that same social manager business role at each one of those levels. Now, the big thing to remember is when it creates those roles at those subsequent levels, you can't edit those. Those are what are called inherited roles. So you can only make a change to that role at the root business unit level, but when you make that change, it'll subsequently transfer down into all of the subsequent options that you're working with. But you do have the capabilities to go in and create new roles at any business unit level, and when you do that, those subsequent roles will then transfer down into the other options. But again, as you have to remember, is a user can only be assigned a role that belongs to the same business unit that they are a member of. And when you move somebody from one business unit to another business unit, it actually removes all of their security roles associated with their account. Even though that security role might exist in that same business unit, it doesn't assume that just because that has a role with the same name, that it's indeed the same thing. So remember that if you switch somebody's business unit, they're going to have all their security roles removed, and therefore they might not have access to the application. So let's look at that inside the application a little bit. So you can see here that up on the top of the security roles, it says business unit. And so it shows me all of the different business units that I have in my application. When I click on sales, it shows me the security roles that I have underneath that specific business unit. Now the difference here is, for example, if I open up salesperson, I can see that this is an inherited role and I really can't make any changes to it. It tells me that in order for me to make changes to this, I would have to subsequently make the changes at the top level. And so this is an important thing to note too as you guys are creating these different business units. If you want to create security roles that are business unit specific, you certainly can do that by going in and selecting the specific business unit you want to work with. So in this case, sales. I could then come in, click on New. I'm going to call this Sales, let's call this CSR, for Customer Service Representative. And then I'm going to just go into Service, and I'm just going to give them full access to the case entity. Now I can go ahead and I can hit Save and Close. I realize I did this in the Sales org, but that's okay. Now, when I look at that, I can see that in the sales area, there is my CSR option. If I go into here and I look at channel sales, I have the same thing. It's transferred down and it's kind of moved over. Now, the other reason I kind of showed you that is I could now go into service. And when I go into service, I would now have the capabilities to also add kind of a different option that I would want to work with, and then define what those specific options would be in here, and then work with items from there. But this gives us the capabilities to kind of start setting these up. But just remember that each business unit will have different versions of the security roles, and just because you're working with one specific option in there, you aren't necessarily going to see that across the board. And that's kind of what you're seeing from this standpoint. When it comes time to assign a security role, you can do it a couple of different ways. You can do it on kind of an individual user by user basis, or you could select multiple users or even multiple teams, and you could assign security roles from there. From a single user perspective, basically you select the user you want to work with, and then there's a manage roles option. And when you click on manage roles, it'll open up all the different security roles that are available for that user based upon the business unit that they belong to. And then you can select basically what role they should or should not have just by using checkboxes. The other option that you would be looking at would be for multiple users. Now, the difference with multiple users is you can select multiple users and you can add different roles for multiple users. However, when you select multiple users, the existing roles that those users have are not shown. So you don't have the ability to remove a role from multiple users. Unfortunately, removing a role has to be done kind of on an individual user by user basis, but assigning, you can do multiple ones. And let's hop into the app here real quick and we'll show you what that looks like. So for example, I can go into my user record and I can select my user record. And now you'll see that I have an option here to say manage roles. When I click on manage roles, it'll show me all the roles that are associated with this user account. I basically just select whatever specific roles I want them to have in the application, and then I kind of click on OK. Now, for multiple users, it's really the same thing. The only difference that you're going to notice, for example, if I click on CRM admin and myself, and I hit manage roles, is now none of those roles have anything associated with them, because it doesn't, each of us might have different roles that we use, so it can't show us specifically what roles are assigned, but I can use this as kind of a universal scenario to assign people specific privileges or items within that role. Now again, it'll tell me that it didn't work, and that's more than likely because we've already had options that were associated with that. But this is where I could go in and kind of select those and then pick what specific options you want to do. The big thing is, keep in mind what business unit people belong to as you're working through. The other thing to keep in mind is if you wanted to switch somebody's business unit. So for example, let's say we have Tony here. We've talked about this a couple of times, but if I switch Tony's business unit, so I come in here and I switch Tony's business unit, actually let's do one quick thing here. Let's open up Tony. Let's give Tony a security role, so let's make him a salesperson. And now if I click on Tony and I go into manage roles again, because I just have one selected, I can see that Tony is a salesperson. If I switch his business unit, so I click on change business unit and I switch his business unit to a different business unit, once this process is complete, and again, it shouldn't take a terribly long here because he doesn't own any records, but if he did, it could take a little while. Now if I go into Tony and I click on manage roles, I can see that he does not have any security roles associated with him, because again, it doesn't assume that just because you had that security role in one business unit that you should have it in the other. Now I can reassign him as a salesperson, click on OK, and now if Tony were to try to log back into the system, he would have the ability to do so. As you saw when we were going through the demo a little bit, I have the ability to associate a user or a team with more than one security role. And that's not a problem, because if you think about it from, just a normal day-to-day business perspective, particularly in smaller organizations, you might have users that wear a lot of different hats. They're not only a salesperson, but they're also a marketing person. So they need to have marketing level access to specific records inside the application. When you start talking about working with multiple security roles, that can be done. What you have to remember, though, is when somebody has more than one security role associated with their account, the combination of privileges and access levels uses what's called kind of the least restrictive method. So let me show you that here a little bit on kind of this slide here that we'd be looking at. So let's just say I have a security role that is called like baseline. So it's the baseline security role that every single person that accesses Dynamics 365 uses. And that baseline security role gives everybody organizational read access to accounts, so they can see all accounts in the system. They can only edit accounts that they own, and they can only assign accounts that they own to other users. So and then from a case standpoint, they have the ability to see all cases that belong to users kind of in the same business unit that they belong to. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another security role to this person called salesperson. And by adding that security role to this person called salesperson, that security role has business unit access to read opportunities, and then user level access to write and assign opportunities. And it doesn't have any access to accounts and cases. So by adding both of those security roles together, what ends up happening is I get kind of a trickle-down effect. And so it looks at all of the different permissions and it kind of moves them in together, and that combination is what ultimately is going to give them access to the account. So now for that particular person, they basically have read access to all accounts at an organization level, the ability to edit and assign accounts that they own, all of the salesperson access to the opportunity stuff, as well as the ability to work with cases at a business unit level. And so this is a great way that you can start using these security roles as kind of stacking privileges to give people additional levels of options based upon what you want to do. So it looks at all their security roles, and it's kind of a combination of both. So by this layered approach, or that method, gives you kind of a unique opportunity. So you remember we talked about when we created a new security role, everything comes in with really no permissions defined. And so sometimes what you'll see people do inside organizations is they'll use this layered approach where they'll have a bunch of different security roles that only have specific permissions to entities based upon what they're trying to do. So you have a salesperson security role that has no access to any of the service stuff, but it has the appropriate access defined for a salesperson to all the sales stuff, so to accounts, opportunities, so on and so forth. And by doing that, now you can just, as people get promotions or as people have different needs inside your organization, you can now start layering these different security roles on top of each other, and now they start to get a combination of each one of those security roles put together and get the least restrictive permissions. So this is a very common approach that you'll sometimes see people do. So for example, I have my baseline, which we talked about earlier. I have my salesperson. So now they're also going to be acting as a sales manager. So from a sales manager perspective, I want them to have specific access. So as a sales manager, I now have the ability to assign accounts for anybody in my same business unit, but it isn't necessarily going to give me any additional rights to read or edit accounts. It's going to give me full-blown parent-child business unit access for opportunities, and then it gives me organization access to read cases as well as the ability to edit cases in my same business unit. So now by doing that and adding that specific situation, it takes all of those individual permissions, it cascades them down, and now you can see that that combination of each one of those is what's ultimately showing up. So now from a salesperson perspective, when it added it in, it threw in and added the salesperson stuff on top of it. Then it looked at the least restrictive permissions for each one that they've been assigned. So the least restrictive for read access on account is the organization at an account level. It's user for write, it's parent-child for assign, because that was what the sales manager was, and then it keeps trickling that information down, and that's ultimately what's going to give them the final access. So this is one way that you'll see people do that, is they'll create a bunch of different smaller business security roles and then just stack them. Now the other option you could do is you could just do a non-layered approach, where you have a salesperson and you have a sales manager. The salesperson has all of the individual permissions associated with what a salesperson would need. The sales manager has all the different permissions that a sales manager would need. Now, if I was a salesperson and I've been promoted to a sales manager, you simply remove the salesperson's security role from my account and make me a sales manager. You could do either one. Neither one is a wrong approach. It's really just a matter of looking at what is the right approach for you as an organization, and then kind of defining which one you want to use moving forward. The final piece to this is Teams. So we had mentioned that you can use Teams as kind of a way to allow groups of users to own records inside the application. Now, one of the things is when you create a team, you don't necessarily have to assign a security role to that team. However, if you want that team to be able to own records, so I want users to actually, to be able to assign that record to a team and every member of that team to be able to own those records, you can do that. In order to do that, or in order to assign ownership, you have to associate it with a security role. So when you create a team, just like any other situation, a team has to be associated with a business unit, because that's kind of what it uses for privileges of working through it. However, even though that team has to belong to a business unit, team members can come from any business unit in the application. So this is where you can sometimes get around that business unit structure, where you can basically say, okay, I have this team called management, and this management team exists in the marketing business unit. Members of this team are coming from sales, portals, all sorts of different scenarios. But when you assign the security role, now it looks at all of those different options and it uses that same scenario. It's the least restrictive access level to all record types for that specific business unit that's going to give them access. So this is where you can really now start to give people additional scenarios. So if they have a user level access to something and now they have team that gives them more access, that team scenario will now give them additional privileges that they may or may not have. Just like if you were stacking individual security roles, same thing is true if you were doing it at a user level as well as a team level. So if you remember that sample security role that we created earlier, that sample security role now exists in the Dynamics Preview business unit. If I select this security role, I have the ability to go up into, or this team, I have the ability to go up into manage roles, and I can now assign this team a security role. And as soon as I do that, now any member who is a part of that team, regardless of what business unit that team member resides in, will now get those permissions that are associated with it. So now you have the ability to really extend this functionality out and work with it on kind of a larger scale. So in theory, a user just has to have a security role associated with their account. So I've even seen situations where somebody is a member of a team, that team has a security role associated with their account, that user now has access even though they don't necessarily have a specific security role associated with their user account. They do have a security role because they have it associated with the team that they belong to. And this, by using these combinations of things, is where you can really start to, extrapolate a lot of different options across the board at an entity level. Now, the final piece to this is obviously depending upon what your situation is when you start working with security roles and different items. If for some reason you have a security role that doesn't necessarily exist or need to exist, obviously you can remove the security role associated with that scenario. It's not going to necessarily hurt anything from a system perspective. Just remember that if there are users that are in that security role that don't have any other security roles associated with their account, they will not have access to the system anymore. So you do need to make sure that any of those users who would require access have now been assigned a specific security role in another instance. So the Dynamics 365 security model is a critical component in any good implementation, because that's what you're really going to use to make sure that you're controlling access to whatever it is, whether it's data, features, UI elements, whatever the options are. Now, as part of that security situation, the security roles themselves use a combination of different access levels and privileges to control the specific access to what they're looking at. So you really need to look at, okay, who is this user? What are they going to be doing within that context of the application? And as you're going through that, and now you know, okay, this is Derek. Derek needs access to these subsets of records. That's where you're going to have to define, okay, here's the privileges and here's the access levels when they're working through it. Now that usually gives you the capabilities to handle most situations when you're working through it. But remember that sometimes you may want to go in and assign multiple security roles. And if you assign multiple security roles to that person's job description, that will then use a least restrictive model that basically says what is going to give them the most access to what they need to be able to do based upon the common security roles that they have associated with it. And from that perspective, now they have the ability to go in and work through the options. So it's really a matter of determining who that user is, what data they need to have access to, and what or how many different positional options they might have within your organization to truly determine what types of security roles and the combinations of security roles that they might need to access the data.